There are moments in financial history when the people managing the system say something in plain public language that most people absorb as noise, but that anyone paying close attention recognizes as a turning point. We are in one of those moments right now. Scott Bessent, the United States Treasury Secretary, the official legally responsible for managing America's debt and overseeing dollar policy, stated clearly that we are in the middle of what he called a Bretton Woods realignment. He described his desire to be part of restructuring the global financial and trade system at its foundational level. Those words, spoken by that person in that role, are among the most consequential public statements made by an American official about the monetary system in at least a generation. Not because they are alarming, because they are honest. And because the last time the world went through a Bretton Woods realignment, the rules of money changed permanently, completely, and more rapidly than most ordinary savers and investors understood, until long after the damage to their purchasing power had already been done. What I want to do today is explain what Bessent actually said, why the data surrounding his statement are even more striking than the statement itself, what the structural forces at work tell us about the direction of capital in this transition, and what 3 specific risks most people are carrying in their portfolios right now without fully understanding them. This is not a prediction. This is a framework. Understanding the environment you are operating in is not optional. It is the prerequisite for every financial decision you make. Let us start at the beginning. In July 1944, with World War II still being fought, but its outcome increasingly clear, representatives of 44 nations gathered in a small resort town in New Hampshire called Bretton Woods. Their task was to design the post-war global monetary system from scratch. The agreement they reached rested on one foundational principle. The United States dollar would serve as the world's reserve currency, and the dollar would be convertible to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. Every other major currency would maintain a fixed exchange rate against the dollar. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank were created as institutional pillars of this arrangement. The United States, which held the majority of the world's gold reserves after the war, became the financial center of the global economy by design. The system worked because it was credible. A government holding dollars held, in practical effect, a claim on physical gold stored in American vaults. The supply of dollars in circulation was constrained by the supply of gold the United States actually possessed, which meant the system had a natural limit on monetary expansion. Inflation stayed structurally low. International trade expanded. The prosperity of the 1950s and early 1960s was not an accident. It was partly the outcome of monetary stability that discouraged governments from printing their way through problems. The system collapsed because the United States violated its own foundational constraint. The Vietnam War was expensive. The domestic social programs of the 1960s were expensive. The combined fiscal pressure required more dollars than the gold supply could honestly support. The government was issuing more receipts than it had assets to back them. Other nations noticed. France formally demanded gold in exchange for its dollar holdings, which was the contractual right of every Bretton Woods member. Other nations began lining up. The resulting outflow of gold from the Federal Reserve threatened to exhaust American reserves entirely. On August 15, 1971, President Nixon appeared on national television and announced the suspension of the dollar's convertibility to gold. He called it temporary. That temporary suspension has now lasted 55 years. The dollar became a fiat currency, backed not by a physical asset, but by the credibility of the United States government, the depth of American financial markets, and the network effects of a global trading system built around dollar settlement over the preceding decades. Now, what Bessent is saying explicitly and on the record is that this system, the dollar-centric, fiat-based, post-Bretton Woods architecture, needs to be restructured, and the policies being pursued are entirely consistent with that stated intention. The framework being assembled has 3 major components. The first is a deliberate weakening of the dollar. The concept has been called the Mar-a-Lago Accord, deliberately echoing the 1985 Plaza Accord, in which major industrial nations coordinated a depreciation of the dollar to correct a severe overvaluation that was damaging American manufacturing competitiveness. The current administration views today's dollar as similarly overvalued, strong enough to suppress domestic industrial investment and sustain trade deficits that they view as structural evidence of an unfair trading system. The dollar has already declined roughly 10% in 2025 alone, its worst first-half performance since 1986, right after the original Plaza Accord. The target depreciation being discussed in policy circles ranges from 20 to 40%. The effects of a move that size are pervasive and asymmetric. Imports become more expensive, raising consumer prices. Exports become more competitive, supporting domestic manufacturing. And every asset priced in dollars, gold, commodities, real estate, rises in nominal value as the currency used to measure them loses purchasing power. This is not speculation, it is arithmetic. The second component is financial deregulation, an unwinding of the post-2008 regulatory architecture. The stated rationale is that excessive regulation has constrained bank lending. The practical consequence is that deregulation increases the capacity for credit creation, which is inflationary, and it reallocates systemic risk from bank balance sheets to the broader economy, and ultimately to taxpayers and savers through inflation, and historically through eventual bailouts. The third component is tariff-driven industrial reshoring. The logic is that decades of globalization hollowed out American industrial capacity, created strategic supply chain vulnerabilities, and exported the employment base that supported the working and middle class. Tariffs raise the cost of imported goods and make domestic production relatively more competitive. The costs are real and front-loaded. Consumers pay higher prices immediately. The benefits are structural and backloaded. Manufacturing capacity rebuilds over years if the policy is sustained. Together, these three moves constitute a coherent attempt to restructure the United States' relationship with the global trading and financial system. Whether they succeed as designed is genuinely uncertain. What is not uncertain is that the attempt is being made deliberately, by the people with the institutional authority to make it, and that its consequences for every asset class are significant and directional. Now let me show you the data that makes Bessent's statement more than rhetorical, because the numbers are striking in ways that deserve to be examined carefully. Start with the dollar's role in global reserves. According to the IMF's Currency Composition of Official Foreign Exchange Reserves database, the most authoritative source on this question in the world, the dollar's share of global central bank reserves peaked at approximately 72% in 2001. As of the second quarter of 2025, that share had declined to 56.32%, the lowest level in roughly 30 years. Total global reserves reached $13 trillion in Q3 2025. Within that pool, the dollar's claim on the world's sovereign savings is structurally contracting. Now look at where central bank reserve managers are moving that capital. They are buying gold. According to the World Gold Council's full year 2025 report, central banks purchased 863 tons of gold last year. While that fell short of the exceptional 1,000-plus ton levels of the three preceding years, it remained substantially above the pre-2022 annual average of 473 tons. The World Gold Council described demand as surprisingly resilient, given that central banks were buying at historically unprecedented price levels. The survey data is even more telling. 95% of central bank reserve managers surveyed expected global official gold reserves to increase over the next 12 months, the highest level of optimism in the survey's 8-year history. A record 43% of central banks indicated plans to increase their own holdings, up from 29% the year before. Not a single respondent anticipated a reduction. The buyers are not fringe economies. Poland's central bank was the largest buyer for the second consecutive year, adding 102 tons in 2025. Kazakhstan hit its highest annual gold, buying on record. Turkey continued steady accumulation. China, India, Brazil, Czech Republic, Ghana, countries across radically different political systems, arriving at the same conclusion about where to hold sovereign reserves in a world where the dominant reserve currency is being deliberately depreciated by its own government. When the people who professionally manage national monetary systems are buying gold at elevated levels, sustained across multiple consecutive years, they are not making a trade. They are expressing a structural view about the long-term reliability of the alternative, dollar-denominated paper assets, that the United States is openly planning to devalue. Now look at the fiscal picture, because this is the structural engine underneath everything else. The Congressional Budget Office's February 2026 projection, the most current authoritative nonpartisan forecast available, projects a federal budget deficit of $1.9 trillion for fiscal year 2026, representing 5.8% of GDP. That deficit is expected to grow to 6.7% of GDP by 2036. Federal debt held by the public is projected to rise from 101% of GDP today to 120% by 2036, surpassing the previous all-time record set just after World War II. The United States is currently spending close to $1 trillion per year on interest on existing debt alone. That figure exceeds the entire defense budget. This is the structural environment inside which the Bretton Woods realignment is being pursued. A government spending dramatically more than it collects, with a debt trajectory every credible forecasting institution has described as unsustainable, deliberately weakening its currency to regain industrial competitiveness. Now let me be direct about what this means for your purchasing power. When the dollar weakens by design, the real value of dollar-denominated savings falls by a corresponding amount. A 20% depreciation means savings held in a standard bank account lose 20% of their international purchasing power. The nominal balance does not change. The number on the screen stays the same. The purchasing power declines. According to Bureau of Labor Statistics data, the dollar has lost approximately 84% of its purchasing power since 1975. Since 1971, since the exact moment the gold constraint was removed, the erosion has been relentless and compounding, largely invisible on any given day, painfully visible when people try to retire, buy a home, or compare what their savings can actually purchase to what they had expected. The current policy environment is explicitly designed to accelerate this process. Now look at what gold has done as a reference point for purchasing power protection in this specific environment. Gold began 2025 at approximately $2,600 per ounce. It closed the year up 65%, the strongest annual gain for gold since 1979. It set 53 new all-time highs during 2025 alone. It surpassed $5,000 per ounce for the first time in history and reached an all-time record of $5,589 per ounce in January 2026. As of April 2026, gold is trading near $4,800 per ounce, supported by continued geopolitical tensions and structural demand from central banks and institutional investors. The historical parallel is worth sitting with. In 1971, gold was fixed at $35 per ounce. In the decade following Nixon's closure of the gold window, gold rose to over $800 per ounce. The people who understood the direction of structural forces before the transition became obvious and asset prices captured that move. The people who held dollar-denominated savings watched their purchasing power erode through what became one of the most severe inflationary decades in American history. Let me now identify the 3 structural risks that I believe are most significantly underestimated by ordinary investors today. The first is what I would call the cash trap. Holding wealth in dollar-denominated cash in a policy environment explicitly designed to depreciate the dollar is not a conservative strategy. It is a strategy that guarantees real purchasing power loss at the rate of dollar depreciation, plus whatever inflation exceeds the nominal interest rate being earned. The CBO projects inflation will not return to the Federal Reserve's 2% target until 2030. The administration is pursuing deliberate dollar depreciation. The structural deficit is running at nearly 6% of GDP. A savings account earning 4% in this environment is not a safe haven. It is a slow, arithmetically certain loss of real value. The people who believe they are being cautious by staying in cash during monetary uncertainty are, in a specific technical sense, the most exposed to the primary risk this policy environment is designed to create. The second risk is concentration in dollar-denominated financial assets without understanding the full extent of that dollar exposure. The S&P 500 appears to offer broad diversification because it contains 500 companies across many sectors. But the index is heavily concentrated in large-cap technology companies, and its dollar exposure is significantly higher than its geographical breadth might suggest. A 20 to 30% dollar depreciation affects the value of foreign revenues, debt structures, and hedging positions in complex ways that depend on each company's specific circumstances. Understanding actual currency exposure embedded in a portfolio is not the same as knowing which stocks or funds it contains. This distinction becomes material precisely when currency moves are large and sustained. The third risk is the timing trap, the belief that the appropriate response to a monetary transition of this magnitude is to wait for certainty before doing anything. Certainty in financial markets never arrives before price. The period of maximum opportunity in any major structural shift is always the period between when the transition becomes visible to those who understand the mechanism and when it becomes visible to everyone else through asset prices. By the time the transition is obvious in prices, the positioning opportunity has passed. In 1971, the people who held gold at $35 per ounce captured a move that ultimately reached $800 over the following decade. They did not know the precise timing. They understood the direction of structural forces. That distinction between knowing exact timing and understanding directional forces is the most practically important distinction in long-horizon investing. Against those three risks, there are three corresponding structural opportunities. Hard assets, gold, silver, physical real estate, productive land, maintain purchasing power across currency depreciation cycles because their supply cannot be expanded by government decree the way currency supply can. Gold occupies a singular position in the current environment. It is simultaneously the historical foundation of monetary systems, the asset that central banks globally are purchasing at elevated levels as they reduce dollar exposure, and the instrument that has historically performed best during the specific combination of dollar weakness and elevated structural inflation that the current policy environment is designed to produce. J.P. Morgan research projects gold could push toward $5,000 per ounce by Q4 2026, with $6,000 a possibility beyond that. This is not a short-term trade thesis. It is a structural allocation thesis driven by the same logic central bank reserve managers are expressing through their own buying behavior. Domestic manufacturing and energy infrastructure represent a genuine structural opportunity if the reshoring thesis is sustained. The policy tools being deployed, tariffs, deregulation, reshoring incentives, are designed to make domestic industrial investment structurally more attractive. If those policies are maintained consistently over the years required for industrial capacity to rebuild, the companies and infrastructure positioned to benefit may see demand growth that current valuations do not fully reflect. Geographic diversification, specifically exposure to economies with strong commodity export bases, provides a structural hedge against dollar-specific risk. Commodity exporters receive more dollars per unit of commodity sold when the dollar weakens. Their terms of trade improve mechanically with each point of dollar depreciation. Many of the emerging market central banks buying gold at record pace are also the economies whose commodity exports make them structural beneficiaries of a weaker dollar. This is not coincidence. It reflects a coherent sovereign strategy for operating in the monetary environment now being publicly described by the United States Treasury Secretary. The framework for navigating this transition is straightforward in structure, though it requires discipline in execution. First, understand your actual dollar exposure, not which country or exchange your assets are listed on, but what currencies generate the cash flows that determine their real-world value. Most portfolios carry far more dollar concentration than their owners realize when they look only at which markets their funds are invested in. Second, hold a meaningful allocation to assets whose value is determined by physical scarcity rather than monetary policy. Sovereign wealth funds and long-horizon institutional investors typically target between 5 and 15% of assets in this category. That range treats hard assets as insurance, essential, sized to provide meaningful protection, but not the primary engine of portfolio returns. Third, resist the timing trap. The transition is already underway. The Treasury Secretary has described it publicly. The IMF reserve data documents it. The central bank gold purchasing behavior confirms it. The CBO's fiscal projections define the structural pressure driving it. Being positioned for a transition that is already in progress is not speculation. It is the application of historical pattern recognition to a present reality that the officials managing the system have already publicly described. The rules of money have changed before, and when they change asymmetrically, with consequences that take years to materialize in the lived experience of ordinary families, but that begin the moment the structural forces shift. They changed in 1944 at Bretton Woods. They changed in 1971 on a Sunday night. They changed in 1985 with the Plaza Accord. And the data from the IMF, from the World Gold Council, from the Congressional Budget Office, from the Federal Reserve's own reserve analysis suggests they are changing again now. The people who understood each of those prior transitions before they became obvious in asset prices had the opportunity to position accordingly. The people who did not experience generational erosions in purchasing power that no amount of diligent saving could fully offset. Understanding the mechanism is necessary. And right now, for perhaps the first time in modern monetary history, the people running the system are describing the mechanism in public. The direction is stated policy. The structural forces are documented in public data. The time between understanding and acting is the only variable that remains within your control.